In a world ruled by silence, fear, and hidden power, emerged a figure capable of transforming drug trafficking into an aerial machine of industrial scale. A man who didn't need to be seen to command respect. A name that became legend long before vanishing. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, known as the Lord of the Skies. While his enemies battled in the streets, he conquered the skies. This is the rise and fall of the strategist who redefined organized crime from above, and whose ending, even today, remains shrouded in mystery. Amado Carrillo Fuentes was born on the 17th of December 1956 in Huamuchilito, a small town in the state of Sinaloa, Mexico. He grew up in a poor rural environment, but one also marked by a deeply rooted clandestine tradition, drug cultivation, and illegal distribution. Sinaloa, home to some of the country's most notorious criminals, was already a fertile ground for future generations of drug traffickers. In that context, Amado forged his character, his vision, and his destiny. The Carrillo family was no stranger to this world. His maternal uncle, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, better known as Don Neto, was one of the founding members of the infamous Guadalajara Cartel, alongside figures like Rafael Caro Quintero and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. He helped lay the foundations of modern drug trafficking in Mexico. From a young age, Amado had direct access to that privileged knowledge. Although he tried a conventional path by studying civil engineering, he dropped out before graduating. Still, he developed technical, structural, and logistical skills that he would later apply with surgical precision to his criminal operation. During the 1970 and 1980, Mexico underwent a profound reconfiguration of its criminal landscape. The dismantling of the Guadalajara Cartel made room for new organizations more dynamic, more violent, and more ambitious. Amado Carrillo navigated this transition wisely, learning, negotiating, and building a power network that would soon make him one of the most feared men in the hemisphere. His first steps in the drug trade were quiet but calculated. He started by working with local operators, observing, learning, and understanding the hidden mechanisms that sustained large-scale drug trafficking. But it didn't take long for him to prove he wasn't just another cog in the machine. He aimed to redesign it completely. One of his first major alliances was with the Arellano Felix brothers, who would later lead the feared Tijuana Cartel. However, Amado had no intention of being a subordinate partner. His mind was already envisioning a far more ambitious operational model, where logistical control would be the key to mastering the business. That's when he found his ultimate advantage, the sky. Unlike other drug lords who relied on land or sea routes, Amado Carrillo understood that the skies offered a faster, less regulated, and with the right technology far more efficient pathway. He began to build one of the most sophisticated aerial transport networks ever seen in the criminal world. Private jets, modified Boeing 727 cargo planes, clandestine airstrips, camouflaged hangars, all were part of an unprecedented operational infrastructure. That network earned him the nickname that would make him legendary, the Lord of the Skies. Through this strategy, he was able to transport tons of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico, and from there to the most lucrative markets in the United States. Each flight was a high-precision surgical operation, designed to evade air patrols and outmaneuver anti-drug agencies. But Amado wasn't just a brilliant logistical operator. He was also a pragmatic negotiator and, when necessary, a ruthless strategist. He forged key alliances with Colombian cartels, especially with the Cali Cartel, and built relationships that ensured a steady drug supply while eliminating rivals who threatened his dominance. Violence and corruption became indispensable tools to sustain his growing power. He bought loyalty, intimidated institutions, and didn't hesitate to use force when needed. Despite his rising influence, he maintained a low profile. He didn't seek the spotlight or lavish luxuries. He valued efficiency over spectacle. But even the quietest empires leave a trail. As his operations expanded, intelligence and security agencies began to close in, investigations intensified, and with them came rumors about his health, whereabouts, and future. What began as a meteoric rise began to shift into a constant struggle to preserve control and avoid collapse. By the 1980s, his consolidation within organized crime had become official. Amado joined the core leadership of the Guadalajara Cartel, led by his uncle, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Neto. Under his protection, he learned not only about smuggling routes and international connections, but also the unwritten rules of the narco world. How to infiltrate institutions, bribe officials, and hold power without exposure. That period was his true school, and he was its brightest student. The murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985 unleashed an unprecedented storm over Mexican drug trafficking. U.S. authorities applied intense pressure, and the Guadalajara Cartel, until then the dominant organization, began to collapse with the arrest of its main leaders. That historic fracture reshaped organized crime in Mexico. It was in that environment of chaos and transition that Amado Carrillo Fuentes decided to forge his own path. His vision was different. Modern, methodical, transnational. He didn't just want to survive the collapse of the old order, he wanted to replace it. His eyes turned to Ciudad Juarez, a strategic border city located across from El Paso, Texas. Traditionally linked to smuggling, Juarez offered more than location. An ideal urban infrastructure, established routes, and a power vacuum that Amado was ready to fill. And he didn't arrive as an unknown. His reputation, his connections with the Cali and Medellin cartels, and his logistical expertise quickly made him a trusted partner for the Colombians. Under his leadership, Juarez became an international drug trafficking air bridge. Amado perfected his business model: surgical efficiency, absolute discretion, and selective use of violence. Through front companies, he acquired an impressive fleet of private jets and modified Boeing 727 seconds, designed to carry tons of cocaine from Colombia to clandestine runways in Mexico, from where it was distributed to the U.S. border. The press and anti-drug agencies soon gave him a name that captured his logistical power: the Lord of the Skies. But that title was not just rhetorical. Amado operated like a war commander in the shadows. He avoided the media, shunned large gatherings, and protected his identity with obsessive precision. His inner circle was extremely tight, and any betrayal was punished with death. Discipline within his organization was strict. There was no room for mistakes. During the 1990s, his power grew at a dizzying pace. The Juarez cartel, under his command, controlled the entire Chihuahua border corridor and extended its influence to states like Sinaloa, Durango, Sonora, Zacatecas, and parts of Coahuila. He controlled airstrips, highways, customs points, and had informants embedded in police forces, customs agencies, and even within the government. In addition, he showed a unique talent for criminal diplomacy. He knew how to negotiate with figures like Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán and the Beltrán Leiva brothers, forging tactical alliances that could be activated or broken depending on the moment. He knew when to make deals, when to strike, and when to disappear. But his rise was not without violence. His fiercest conflict was with the Tijuana cartel, led by the Arellano Felix brothers. The war over northwestern trafficking routes left a trail of blood: executions, massacres, public attacks, and a silent war that caused panic in several northern cities. Even so, Amado's empire remained standing. While other drug lords fell under the weight of spectacle and brutality, he survived thanks to a different formula: strategy, anonymity, and absolute control of the skies. The true power of Amado Carrillo Fuentes wasn't just measured in trafficking routes or tons of drugs transported. His brilliance lay in something far more sophisticated: the ability to turn illegal money into legitimate power. Throughout the 1990, Carrillo expanded his operation into the heart of the financial system. He quietly invested in real estate, construction firms, luxury hotels, property developments, banks, and front companies. His goal was clear: inject drug money into the legal economy without leaving a trace. And he achieved it with a level of mastery that confounded even the most experienced investigators. Much of his success came from this invisible control. His money moved through accounts, contracts, and legal businesses, blending into national and international economic circuits. This is how he built a camouflaged empire. His name rarely appeared, but his shadow was everywhere. He developed an aura of untouchability. Many local and even federal authorities looked the other way. In certain regions, his influence was so powerful that security forces didn't dare act without his tacit approval. As anti-drug agencies in Mexico and the US intensified their pursuit, Amado vanished. He moved like a ghost, surrounded by paid loyalties, protected by networks of corruption, and with an operational structure built to function even in his absence. He always stayed one step ahead. At the height of his power, even the most conservative estimates suggest he controlled 60% of the cocaine entering the United States from Mexico. His fortune was incalculable, his face unknown to most. But his legend spread quietly among partners and pursuers alike. No criminal empire is indestructible. Over time, cracks began to appear. International pressure mounted. Internal tensions within his organization grew. And, as with any structure built on absolute power, betrayal soon followed. Still, throughout the 1,990 seconds, Amado Carrillo Fuentes reached the peak of international drug trafficking. While other cartels fought bloody wars over routes, he already owned them. His style was neither impulsive nor reckless. He operated like a businessman, a high-level executive overseeing every detail. From flight routes to financial meetings, from pilot selection to offshore accounting. He was no longer just the leader of the Juarez Cartel. He had become a multinational operator. He maintained strong ties with major Colombian cartels, who trusted him as their primary distributor in Mexico. He also had a presence in Central America, the Caribbean, and the United States, where his product arrived quickly, cleanly, and without a trace. One of Amado's greatest achievements was transforming the Juarez Cartel into more than just a trafficking network. He turned it into a criminal corporation. A perfectly structured holding with a hierarchical command, specialized logistics, financial advisors, communication technicians, lawyers, and plaza chiefs in key cities. Everything answered to one man. And that man still operated from the shadows. Amado Carrillo Fuentes' empire rested on four fundamental pillars: aerial dominance, institutional corruption, control of land routes, and a sophisticated money laundering system that blurred the lines between legal and illegal. His face, unknown to most. But his legend spread quietly among partners and pursuers alike. No criminal empire is indestructible. Over time, cracks began to appear. International pressure mounted. Internal tensions within his organization grew. And, as with any structure built on absolute power, betrayal soon followed. Still, throughout the 1,990 seconds, Amado Carrillo Fuentes reached the peak of international drug trafficking. While other cartels fought bloody wars over routes, he already owned them. His style was neither impulsive nor reckless. He operated like a businessman, a high-level executive overseeing every detail. From flight routes to financial meetings, from pilot selection to offshore accounting. He was no longer just the leader of the Juarez Cartel. He had become a multinational operator. He maintained strong ties with major Colombian cartels, who trusted him as their primary distributor in Mexico. He also had a presence in Central America, the Caribbean, and the United States, where his product arrived quickly, cleanly, and without a trace. One of Amado's greatest achievements was transforming the Juarez Cartel into more than just a trafficking network. He turned it into a criminal corporation. A perfectly structured holding with a hierarchical command, specialized logistics, financial advisors, communication technicians, lawyers, and plaza chiefs in key cities. Everything answered to one man. And that man still operated from the shadows. Amado Carrillo Fuentes' empire rested on four fundamental pillars: aerial dominance, institutional corruption, control of land routes, and a sophisticated money laundering system that blurred the lines between legal and illegal. While other cartels collapsed into open warfare, Amado invested in technology, logistics, and bribes. His strategy was clear: not to win with violence, but with information, precision, and invisible power. And it worked. One of the most unsettling aspects of his structure was the level of institutional infiltration he achieved. He managed to place collaborators in key levels of the Mexican government: security forces, customs, ministries, prosecutors' offices, and even within the judiciary. Thanks to these connections, he didn't need to rely on hitmen or violent attacks as frequently as his rivals. He had privileged information. He knew when and where to act, when to halt operations, and when to vanish entirely. His empire was not only built on cocaine, but also on apparent legitimacy. He invested millions in real estate developments, hotels, shopping centers, and tourist complexes. To the public eye, many of these projects seemed legal, but behind them was one of the most complex and effective money laundering networks in Latin America. To protect his freedom, Carrillo monitored every detail of his personal life with the same rigor as his criminal operations. He avoided visible excesses. He constantly changed residences, used false identities, and rarely reused phone numbers. He moved with trained escorts, many of them former military or ex-agents, and maintained a tight inner circle. In every sense, he was a man of the shadows, but not even such a meticulous structure was free from cracks. The balance he had built began to destabilize. Tensions with the Arellano Felix brothers, leaders of the Tijuana Cartel, escalated into a silent but bloody war. They battled over key territories like Baja California and the Pacific Corridor. The consequences were brutal: selective killings, bombings, disappearances. At the same time, the Sinaloa cartel, bolstered by the cunning of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, was beginning to rise as a major force. International agencies like the DEA and Interpol intensified their pressure. And within his own organization, dissenting voices emerged. Mid-level commanders craving more power, internal fractures testing his grip. Despite it all, Amado had a decisive advantage over his enemies: time. He had built such a solid and autonomous network that it could operate without his physical presence. He had loyal operatives, secure routes, aircraft in constant motion, and an encrypted communication system that allowed him to monitor and make decisions from hiding. Even in secrecy, he continued to rule with deadly precision. By the end of his career, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was considered the most powerful drug trafficker in Mexico. It was said he could move up to 200 tons of cocaine per year, and his fortune was estimated in the billions. His network spanned the entire continent, and his legend was no longer an urban myth. It had become an uncomfortable reality for entire governments. But like every empire built on secrecy, money, and fear, Amado's end was drawing near. And it would come through one of the most mysterious disappearances in the history of organized crime. In the world of organized crime, the rise is usually steeped in violence, but it is the fall that defines the legend. And in the case of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, that fall was as enigmatic as it was powerful. By mid-1997, his name was synonymous with absolute control. Aerial routes, million-dollar shipments, bought politicians, and a fortune that defied all estimates. He was, without a doubt, the most wanted drug trafficker in Mexico and one of the most dangerous men on the planet. But his power was starting to shake. International pressure was mounting. The DEA was closing in. The Mexican government, accused of inaction against organized crime, began to need visible results. Amado knew his freedom hung by a thread, and he made a decision that would surprise even his enemies. In a desperate attempt to avoid capture, he underwent plastic surgery to change his face. An extreme and bold maneuver with fatal consequences. On the 4th of July, 1997, he entered a private hospital in Polanco, one of Mexico City's most exclusive areas. He used a false name. The procedure was delicate, a combination of cosmetic surgery and liposuction. According to the official version, Amado Carrillo died during the operation due to complications from the anesthesia. The news exploded like a bomb. How could the most wanted drug lord in the country die in a hospital bed without anyone arresting him? How did he manage to enter a private clinic without being identified? Why risk his life during an international manhunt? The official answers convinced no one. It was reported that he suffered respiratory arrest due to a medication overdose. However, the doubts began to multiply. Even within security institutions, there was skepticism. Some agents believed he had faked his death, with the complicity of doctors, military personnel, and high-ranking government officials. A few days later, the story took an even darker turn. The two doctors who performed the surgery were found murdered and brutally tortured. Their bodies were discovered in cement-filled barrels, abandoned on a roadside in the state of Guerrero. A clear message: silence was mandatory. That crime shook even the most skeptical. What power was behind those killings? What secret had to be buried? The autopsy of the body attributed to Amado Carrillo was carried out quickly, under strict security. His identity was confirmed, and immediate burial was ordered in Sinaloa. But the funeral was private, silent, and surrounded by mystery. Witnesses claimed the corpse had a completely different face. Others insisted that not even his closest relatives were sure of his identity. The casket was sealed. The ceremony, brief. The secret, untouched. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the man who had dominated the skies of drug trafficking, had vanished from the map. But what followed was not peace, but a storm of questions. The official version was blunt. Amado Carrillo Fuentes was dead. The DEA supported the Mexican government's reports, stating that his death caused an immediate reshuffling within the country's criminal structures. But outside official statements, skepticism continued to grow. Some said the burial site was changed days later, that the body was never shown to anyone, and that the funeral was carried out under extreme discretion, with a secrecy that only fooled suspicions. To many retired agents, investigative journalists, and even members of the criminal underworld, the story was different. Amado wasn't dead. He had disappeared. It was said that he paid millions of dollars to fake his death and escape, possibly to Cuba, Argentina, or even Russia. The surgery was not an accident, but part of a perfectly calculated strategy to erase his identity and close his public chapter. Circumstantial evidence reinforced the theory. There were no major seizures after his supposed death. No significant arrests were made among his main operators. And his criminal structure continued to operate with unsettling normalcy for years. Even some protected witnesses, former allies, and operators of the Juarez cartel later claimed that Amado was alive, operating from the shadows under a different identity and protected by a high-level network of contacts. Whatever the truth may be, his disappearance marked the end of an era, and the beginning of a more fragmented, more chaotic, and far more violent phase. Leadership of the Juarez cartel was left vacant. The ironclad stability that Amado had maintained for years, through clear hierarchies and strict codes of loyalty, began to collapse. The question was inevitable: who would inherit the empire? The first name to emerge was that of his younger brother, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, nicknamed El Viceroy. A reserved, calculating man, and Amado's right hand for years, Vicente assumed control with the intention of preserving the legacy. But the throne he inherited was no longer the same. Vicente did not command the same automatic respect as his brother, and his rise to power was seen by many as an opportunity to climb the ranks, settle scores, or fight for territory. What had once been a cohesive empire quickly became an internal battlefield, where loyalty was no longer an absolute value, but just another bargaining chip in the game of ambition. After the supposed death of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, his younger brother Vicente inherited an empire that appeared intact from the outside, but was already showing signs of internal decay. One of his first challenges was containing Los Muertos, a violent faction within the Juarez cartel, known for acting beyond the chain of command. At the same time, Vicente had to deal with the ambitions of regional operators, especially in Ciudad Juarez, who, after years of serving Amado, believed their time had come to seize control of key territories. But the problems did not only come from within. On the outside, enemies were circling. Amado's fall was seen by rival cartels as a unique opportunity to weaken the Juarez Cartel. The Sinaloa Cartel, led by Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, which had been growing quietly and cunningly, began to expand aggressively. The Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana Cartel also sought to gain ground in the northwest of the country. The response was immediate and bloody. Targeted executions, ambushes, kidnappings of key operatives, internal betrayals. The streets of Ciudad Juárez became the scene of a silent war that soon erupted into open conflict. As violence escalated, the political influence the Juarez cartel had built over years also began to crumble. Officials who once protected the organization started to distance themselves. Some were arrested. Others silenced. The flow of privileged information vital for keeping operations running was drastically reduced. Meanwhile, U.S. agencies intensified their involvement in anti-narcotics operations within Mexico. The DEA, FBI, and other institutions began working more closely with Mexican authorities, pushing for high-profile arrests and the dismantling of financial networks. Vicente tried to uphold his brother's legacy through terror tactics, temporary alliances, and strategic repositioning in the north of the country. But the prestige of the Juarez cartel was no longer the same. The lack of visionary leadership, internal disorder, and the brutal advance of the Sinaloa cartel triggered a gradual collapse. What had once been the nerve center of continental drug trafficking turned into an urban battlefield. Between 2008 and 2012, Ciudad Juárez was considered the most dangerous city in the world. Bullets replaced order. Bodies appeared in the streets. Disappearances multiplied. Thousands died in a war that originated with the fall of the man who once ruled the skies. In 2014, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was captured by federal forces. His arrest was the final major blow to an organization already surviving on the ruins of its past. Since then, the Juarez cartel has been reduced to scattered fragments, mired in internal conflict, overtaken by emerging groups, and lacking a figure capable of filling the void left by its founder. The empire built with precision by the Lord of the Skies collapsed under the weight of betrayal, war, and the absence of leadership. And although the cartel still exists on a smaller scale, its golden age was buried with the myth of Amado Carrillo Fuentes. But his story is far from over, because for many, Amado never died. From the moment his death was announced, the shadow of mystery enveloped the name Amado Carrillo Fuentes. The official version stated that he died during cosmetic surgery at a private hospital in Mexico City. But something didn't add up. Too many unanswered questions. Too many uncomfortable silences. And above all, an execution so clean, so surgically perfect, that many saw it more as an intelligence operation than a medical accident. The first to doubt were not journalists or curious onlookers, but security agents, crime analysts, and even Carrillo's old enemies. The most widespread theory was clear. Amado didn't die, he faked his death. He had the resources, the contacts, and the logistical control to plan a complete disappearance. He wouldn't have been the first to do it, but likely the only one to do it with such sophistication. According to this version, the surgery did happen, but not for aesthetic reasons. The goal was to erase his physical identity, transform himself, and disappear from the radar. And the location was no accident. Santa Mónica Hospital, located in one of the country's most exclusive areas, offered privacy, discretion, and staff susceptible to corruption or intimidation. Shortly after his alleged death, a chilling event raised even more suspicion. The doctors who performed the procedure were murdered. Their bodies were found inside cement-filled drums, brutally tortured. A silent but unmistakable message. The case had to be closed, with no witnesses or testimonies. Why silence the surgeons if everything had been an accident? Another theory suggested something even more disturbing. The body presented wasn't Amado's, but that of a double. Someone surgically altered to resemble him, buried under his name, while the real capo escaped to an unknown destination. The details only fed the doubt. A closed burial, with no public access. Contradictions in the descriptions of the body. The refusal to show the face. And an autopsy carried out with unusual speed. Within days, the case was closed, leaving no room for reviews or independent investigations. Since then, the rumor has traveled across Latin America and beyond. Some claim to have seen Amado in Argentina, others in Chile. There are those who place him in Spain, Brazil, even Russia. Always under a new identity, always protected, always silent. None of these accounts have ever been verified. But in the world of organized crime, absence can be more powerful than death. Even within the drug world, there are those who insist that the Lord of the Skies is still alive. That he never left the game. That he still moves the pieces from the shadows, hidden behind a new face, a new life, and the same allies who once helped him build his empire. Some versions suggest that Amado Carrillo Fuentes negotiated his exit with sectors of power. He gave up roots, strategic contacts, or high-level favors in exchange for total freedom. Others claim he simply retired and now lives in a country without an extradition treaty, beyond the reach of Mexico or the United States. In later interviews, even former DEA agents and retired military officials admitted an uncomfortable truth. They were never completely sure that Amado was really dead. Although the case was closed in official records, in intelligence circles it remains an open file. An unsolved puzzle. Another, darker theory suggests that Amado was betrayed from within. That those who knew the secrets of his empire saw his fall as a chance to seize control of the business. A conspiracy disguised as a medical accident. A settling of scores hidden behind a surgical mask. But instead of clearing up the mystery, time only deepened it. Unlike figures like Pablo Escobar, whose death was documented in every detail, Amado's story is shrouded in silence. There are no clear photos of the body. No public burial records. No posthumous trial. Only a statement, a sealed grave, and an absence that became legend. Nearly 3 decades later, his image still lives on in corridos, in television shows, on the streets, and in popular memory. For many, Amado isn't dead. He just vanished. Perhaps he's still watching from somewhere in the world, seeing how his legacy endures, how his model is replicated, how his myth continues to grow. Because Amado Carrillo Fuentes is no longer just a name in criminal archives. He's a shadow, a ghost that was never captured, a legend that transcended life and fear. The Lord of the Skies didn't just dominate the air, he forever changed drug trafficking in Mexico and across the continent. His mark runs deep, even decades later. While other kingpins sought notoriety, weapons, and cameras, Amado chose silence, strategy, and logistical precision. And that made him the architect of a new criminal paradigm. Before him, drug trafficking was a rustic business, limited to land and sea. After him, it became a global industry, with a corporate structure and continental reach. One of the most revolutionary aspects of his legacy was the use of air transport as the backbone of his operations. Carrillo invested millions in building a private fleet, executive jets, adapted cargo planes, clandestine airstrips, aeronautical technicians, and corrupt air traffic controllers. A mobility system designed with a military mindset and business precision. Thanks to this network, the massive movement of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico and from there to the US became faster, more efficient, and harder to trace. His strategy changed the rules of the game. After Amado, all major cartels began to replicate his model. Planes, helicopters, private hangars. The skies became the new frontier of crime. Amado Carrillo Fuentes' legacy isn't just the myth of his disappearance. His true inheritance was the professionalization of organized crime. He transformed the Juarez Cartel into more than a criminal network. He turned it into a corporate structure with internal departments and specific roles, like a multinational company. Finance, logistics, operations, security, intelligence, international relations, Each area had managers, hierarchies, and protocols. He was one of the first kingpins to use shell companies, frontmen, and parallel legal structures to launder money without raising suspicion. He used banks, construction companies, hotel chains, and real estate firms to infiltrate the formal economy with drug money. This model would be replicated and perfected by the major cartels that followed: Sinaloa, Los Zetas, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Many of his former operatives, after Juarez's downfall, migrated to these organizations, bringing with them his discipline, operational structure, and network of contacts. But one of the most disturbing aspects of his legacy was institutional infiltration. Amado wasn't satisfied with bribing police or border agents. His network penetrated the Attorney General's office, the armed forces, local governments, and even federal power spheres. He bought protection, yes, but he also bought silence. And above all, he bought information, the most valuable weapon in a world where one wrong move could mean death. That level of institutional penetration became, over time, the operational standard of Mexican organized crime. Amado taught that true power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to know how to listen, move, and disappear. He also changed how the narco was perceived by society. While old kingpins were rustic, armed, loud, and visible figures, he projected a businesslike, almost invisible image. He didn't give interviews, he didn't attend parties, he stayed out of the public eye. His silence demanded respect, his absence created fear. After him, many criminal leaders understood that power doesn't lie in being seen but in not being found. However, his disappearance didn't leave behind order, but a vacuum. With his exit, organized crime entered a phase of fragmentation, betrayal, and unprecedented violence. If Amado had been the architect of order within chaos, what came next was total disorder. Internal wars, territorial breakdowns, conflicts without codes. The map of Mexican drug trafficking splintered. And with that, the country experienced one of the most violent periods in its recent history. Even so, the mold he left behind remains intact. Figures like Joaquín, El Chapo Guzmán, the Beltrán Leiva brothers, Ismael, El Mayo Zambada, or Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes, aka El Mencho, adopted his methods, his low profile, his laundering networks, and his strategic approach. Some even worked under him before founding their own cartels. Today, his mark can be traced in how millions of dollars flow through legal companies, in the clandestine air routes still in use, and in the reserve style adopted by modern drug lords. Amado didn't just build an empire. He taught how to sustain it, even after disappearing. Even if his body was never shown, his presence is impossible to hide. Every jet flying undetected, every tower built with illicit money, every structure that prioritizes intelligence over violence, bears his signature. The ghost of the Lord of the Skies still flies. The invisible power. Rarely, in the history of drug trafficking, has real power been so hard to see, and so impossible to stop. Beyond his aerial fleet or dominance of international trafficking, Amado Carrillo Fuentes left a deep and often invisible mark on Mexico's political and institutional structures. His greatest achievement wasn't just moving tons of cocaine. It was doing so untouched, while the eyes of the state looked the other way, or worked directly for him. During the 1980 seconds and 90 seconds, he understood something that would change the game forever. Violence can impose fear, but corruption imposes obedience. While other drug lords challenged the state with fire and bullets, Amado chose another path: silence, bribery, and infiltration. He was one of the first major drug lords to apply the principle of silver or lead with diplomacy. He didn't seek to confront the government, but to move within it, to manipulate it from the inside. He built a protection network that included local politicians, police commanders, judges, prosecutors, military officers, governors, even figures within the judiciary. He knew exactly where to place each piece, what information to buy, who to finance, and who to eliminate. In the states under his control, customs officers didn't inspect his shipments. His planes landed and took off from airports without alerts. Local police didn't chase him. They obeyed him. His network of complicity was so solid that his criminal structure operated as a silent extension of the institutional apparatus. One of the most discussed, though never publicly confirmed links, was with high-ranking officials of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, which ruled Mexico for over 70 years. Intelligence reports and leaked statements suggest that several key politicians received bribes or favors in exchange for allowing him to operate unimpeded. There was also talk of a strategic relationship with the military. It was said that high-ranking officers received monthly payments, properties, luxury vehicles, or even trips abroad, all funded by the cartel. In return, they provided protection and information about DEA operations. Institutional corruption was the silent foundation of his empire, and at the same time, his greatest contribution to a model that would forever change the relationship between crime and the state in Mexico. Because Amado Carrillo Fuentes demonstrated something terrifying. Drug trafficking was not an external enemy of the system. It was part of the system. It financed it, infiltrated it, influenced it, and in many cases, directed it. After him, the figure of the drug trafficker was no longer just that of an armed criminal. It became that of a silent political actor, capable of influencing elections, appointments, and legislative decisions. He was the architect of a new era of organized crime, one where true power is not seen, but felt in every corner of the state. Amado Carrillo Fuentes' power wasn't only built from the skies, nor did it reside only in the halls of government. It also took root in the streets, in communities, in the social fabric of entire regions where the state had abandoned its most basic functions. In cities like Ciudad Juarez, Culiacán, Hermosillo, or Chihuahua, his name wasn't just associated with crime, but with order, stability, and money flowing. For thousands of families, drug trafficking wasn't a threat. It was the only functioning economy. Carrillo understood this institutional void and filled it with infrastructure and tangible benefits. Schools, sports fields, churches, roads. He funded local festivals, distributed food supplies, sponsored youth teams, not out of generosity, but strategy. Loyalty is built through support, and power is protected from below. In many of these places, Amado wasn't seen as a criminal. He was a benefactor, a man who delivered where the government failed. A symbol of silent efficiency. This phenomenon, repeated across various regions, changed how drug traffickers were perceived. It was no longer just about violence and fear. It was also about respect, admiration, and, in some cases, idealization. Over time, that ambiguous vision became culture. Corridos emerged, narrating his life as epic tales, legends that spoke of his intelligence, his absolute control, his perfect escape. Entire generations grew up venerating his figure not for his brutality, but for his ability to move in the shadows, with a cold mind and a firm hand. But this symbiotic relationship between crime and society had consequences. It normalized corruption. In many parts of the country, it became accepted, even expected, that money solved everything. A license, a contract, a promotion, impunity. Power was no longer in municipal palaces, but in the quiet homes of criminal bosses. That's where routes, budgets, alliances, and fates were decided. Amado didn't invent that system. He perfected it. He turned it into a structure, and he exported it. His model laid the foundations for a new relationship between Narco and state, where boundaries were erased and crime ceased to be an external threat, becoming a functional part of the system. And the most disturbing part is that his legacy didn't die with him. It was replicated. It was absorbed by new generations of criminal leaders who understood that violence is useful, but real power is imposed with money, agreements, and control from the shadows. During his life, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was the capo no one saw coming, and no one could reach. But after his disappearance, he became something more powerful than a drug lord. A myth. A cultural figure, a living legend. His story had all the elements of a dark hero: ambition, intelligence, betrayal, disappearance, and an ending so perfect it seemed written for fiction. Unlike other media-driven capos like Pablo Escobar or El Chapo Guzmán, Amado avoided the spotlight. His reserved, almost corporate style, his obsession with anonymity, and his apparent bloodless death made him an ideal character to be told, interpreted, reinvented, and that's exactly what happened. The narco who vanished without a trace. The strategist no one could catch. The ghost who, according to some, still moves the pieces from the shadows. One of the first spaces where his name began to resonate strongly was in the popular music of northern Mexico. Corridos turned into sung chronicles of criminal power, were the first to tell his story with tones of respect and, at times, admiration. Titles like El Señor de los Cielos, Amado Carrillo Vive, or El Dueño del Aire celebrated his rise, his ability to move tons of drugs by air, and his talent for remaining untouchable. In many communities, these corridos were not just songs, they were collective memory, homage, and resistance. But it was with the arrival of television that his figure crossed the border of local myth and became a global phenomenon. In 2013, the Telemundo network premiered the series El Señor de los Cielos, directly inspired by his life. Though the production took major creative liberties, it portrayed in a telenovela style a capo determined to change his face to escape the government. The result: a media phenomenon that captivated millions of viewers in Latin America and the United States. This version, fictionalized and stylized, solidified Amado as a global cultural figure. His story was translated into multiple languages, debated on social media, turned into memes, costumes, parodies, and even analyzed in universities, where his case is studied as a reflection of contemporary narco culture. Later, the series Narcos, Mexico depicted him again, this time in a more sober and realistic tone. There, Amado was portrayed as he truly was: a cold negotiator, a brilliant logistics operator, and a man who left no loose ends. A crime architect with a business mindset, but his impact goes beyond screens and songs. In many regions of Mexico, his figure became a symbol of alternative power, especially in marginalized communities where the state has systematically failed. For some, Amado was much more than a capo. He was the man who protected his own, who knew how to move discreetly, who never needed to show off to be feared. A strategist who embodied silent success in a country where legality doesn't always offer a clear path. This phenomenon, known as narco idolatry, has grown over the years, and Amado Carrillo Fuentes holds a special place within that popular reverence. Unlike other drug lords who were killed, betrayed, or exposed, he simply vanished. And in that total absence, he found cultural immortality. Today, his face appears on t-shirts, mugs, graffiti, collectible figures, and millions of social media profiles. On YouTube, videos about his life rack up millions of views. On TikTok, his name resurfaces constantly, tied to private jets, golden guns, phrases he never said, but that now form part of his persona. The line between the real man and the fictional character has been completely blurred. And although many see this romanticization of organized crime as a social risk for distorting reality and glorifying violence, the truth is that Amado Carrillo Fuentes is no longer just part of Mexico's criminal archives. He is part of its contemporary culture, a symbol living both in journalistic accounts and popular myths. A man who, without seeking fame, ended up becoming a legend. A kingpin who didn't need cameras or scandals to be remembered. A shadow that still flies over the skies of drug trafficking. At the end of this long journey, from his humble beginnings to his mysterious disappearance, the question still lingers. Who was Amado Carrillo Fuentes, really? Just another drug trafficker among many? A criminal mastermind who understood the system before anyone else? A victim of the same power that once protected him? Or a mythological figure who knew how to disappear just in time to become immortal? One thing is certain: Amado was much more than a capo. He was a cold, methodical, calculating strategist who turned the drug trade into a parallel business empire. He didn't just buy planes and plot routes. He created his own economy, a power network, an authority that rivaled the state. He understood that discretion is more effective than fear, that sustained corruption has more impact than direct violence, and that true power doesn't need to be seen, only felt. In that model, the drug trafficker stopped being an armed outlaw and became a political operator, a silent investor, a shadow diplomat. Amado didn't just move shipments. He moved structures. He moved wills. He moved borders. And his supposed death, full of gaps, contradictions, and mysteries, only strengthened the narrative he helped build himself. That of the man no one could catch, and who perhaps never left. Beyond the character lies his real legacy. He changed the rules of the game, reshaped political structures, redefined the role of drug trafficking in Mexico's economy, and left behind a void that was filled by a violence even more fragmented, more brutal, and more unpredictable. Organized crime in Mexico was never the same after him, nor was the way society understood and sometimes admired its protagonists. For some, Amado was a symbol of power and intelligence. For others, a criminal who corrupted the country to its core. And for many more, a shadow that still floats over the drug routes, the halls of power, and television screens. His story leaves us with one final lesson. True power doesn't always lie in weapons or spotlights. It lies in knowing when to move, when to stay silent, and how to disappear without a trace, but without ever being forgotten. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, dead or alive, capo or legend, victim of the system or architect of his own mythology. We may never know for sure, but one thing is undeniable. His name, his story, and his legacy will continue to hover above us like an eternal echo in the skies of crime. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life, power, and mystery of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share the video. It helps us keep producing content with the same depth and rigor. See you in the next case. Because as long as there's history, there will be mystery.